Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hey friend, I'm your host, Esther Littlefield. Welcome to episode 80 of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. Today, I'm going to be chatting with my co-host, Holly, and our guest, Sharon Hodde Miller. If you're listening to this live, it's the last day of 2019, and this episode is the last episode in our communication series. Holly and I were talking about the fact that we could probably have an entire podcast on the issue of communication, but we're definitely not going to be doing that. So we hope that you've enjoyed this communication series that we have been doing, and I think you are going to love this final conversation with Sharon. I invited Sharon to be on the podcast because I've been following her for several years, and I read her book, Nice, this past year, and it has really made an impact on me. And I love how she talks about some of the same topics that we have been getting into on the podcast. And so in this episode, you are going to hear about Sharon's leadership journey, which includes doing ministry right alongside her husband in a way that she never anticipated. We also talk about how niceness should not be our goal as Christians, and how it can blind us to the truth, and how saying hard things is actually about being loving rather than being nice. We get into so much more than just those topics on this episode, so I'm really excited for you to hear this conversation. But before we dive in, let me introduce you to Sharon a little bit more. Sharon Hodde Miller leads Bright City Church in Durham, North Carolina, alongside her husband, Ike. In addition to earning her PhD, she has blogged at sheworships.com for nearly 10 years, making God's Word accessible to women everywhere. She is the author of Nice, Why We Love to Be Liked and How God Calls Us to More, and Free of Me, Why Life is Better When It's Not About You. She's also been a regular contributor to Propel, She Reads Truth, and Christianity Today, and she's written for Relevant and many other publications and blogs. So she is a speaker and author. She's also a mom to 3 kiddos and a wife, and I know you're going to love hearing from Sharon. So let's go ahead and dive in. Welcome to the show, Sharon. We are so glad to have you here.
Hi, it's great to be with you.
Today, we want to dive into the issue of niceness and why we as leaders are not called to be nice. But first, we'd really like to hear a little bit more about you, Sharon, and your leadership journey. So can you tell us about how you're leading right now?
So right now, my husband and I are leading a church that we planted just over a year ago. It was September of 2018. And I have a teaching pastor position there. My husband is the lead pastor. And so we are doing that. And it is a wild and crazy and humbling adventure.
That's awesome. And you have a few children as well. So you're leading at home too, it sounds like. And you also do all your writing.
Yeah.
So you have a lot going on.
It's totally boring around here. I just lay around and eat bonbons. It's awesome. So the summer before we launched, I had just had our 3rd child, and I was finishing up my 2nd book, and we were about to launch a church. And that was horrible. And so this past summer, we had a summer redo where I said, okay, we're just forgetting the last summer. We're not doing that again. We're going to actually have fun this summer. So yeah, it was a really, really crazy time. But we made it.
That's awesome. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about kind of how you got to this point where you and your husband have planted this church, and
Hmm.
what brought you into leadership to
Hmm.
begin with.
Yeah, it's a very twisty, turny story. So I first discerned a call to ministry in college, and I wasn't really sure what that was going to look like. And so when I graduated from college, I moved back to Charlotte, which is where I'm from. And I worked for Proverbs 31 Ministries, if you guys are familiar. And back then it was very small. I think there was maybe 5 of us, and I just had an internship. And so I was sort of learning the ropes of ministry, and I was traveling with Lisa Turkhurst and just learning from her. And I learned a lot, like especially about traveling. There's a lot that I learned just from that year that I worked there. But I also, during that season, realized that I was called in a different direction. One thing I noticed at the time is that for a lot of women in ministry who were authors and speakers, that their platform was usually their story. That was kind of the thing that propelled them into ministry, is they survived something, that they overcame something, and their testimony was their platform. But I was, this nice Christian girl who did not have anything like that. I'd always believed in Jesus, and I'd always been a really good kid and hadn't really rebelled or anything like that. And so my testimony just was really boring. And I thought, well, now what? What do I do? And that's when I had the thought, well, men don't have to have a testimony in order to go into ministry. They just go to seminary. And so that's what I did. So I left Proverbs 31 and I went back to school and I got my MDiv. And then I spent a number of years working in college ministry and started writing more. And then my husband and I we moved up to Chicago and we both got our PhDs there. And I kept writing, was starting to speak a lot more. And it was really funny because Ike and I were just talking about this actually. So he was a pastor and I was speaking and writing. And occasionally he would say, I feel like we're supposed to do something together. And I would think, I don't know what that would be. Like you're a pastor and I'm doing this other thing. I don't know how we could ever lead something together, because I just we never thought we'd start a church. I didn't have a dream of being a pastor or anything. And so whenever he would say that, I would kind of like pat him on the head, like, okay, that's sweet, honey, thanks. Which was also really discouraging to him, because I think he thought, oh, she doesn't want to work with me. So anyway, long story short is after he was a young adults pastor for a number of years, he got this vision of planting a church, and we had never wanted to do it. We'd always sworn up and down we wouldn't do it because we knew other people that had planted, and it's really hard. And
Yeah.
we, weren't trying to sign up for that, but it was one of those things where God made it so abundantly clear that it felt like he was kind of grabbing us by the collar and saying, no, you're going to do this. And so we eventually said yes. And one of the things as we were thinking through what my role would be is he wanted me to have a pastor title. And I theologically am fine with that. But in terms of my stage of life, I was unsure if I had the margin for the expectations that are attached to that title. Because like you said, I've got 3 very little children and they are, top priority. I also already travel. I write, all those things that I'm doing. And so I just didn't know how I could squeeze it in. And he said, well, just a teaching pastor. That way that's just kind of what you're going to do. But he also said, and this tells you a lot about my husband, is that the Raleigh-Durham area is one of the most highly educated areas in the country. Just because we live between three major universities, there's tons of people with advanced degrees. It's just very, very educated. And so women are professors here. They are CEOs. They are attorneys. They're doctors. Women are leading in the workplace, but not in the church, especially not in evangelical churches. And he said, we need to be teaching these women how to lead, as Christians. Like, what does it mean to lead as Christians? And if there's no model for them in a church, this feels like a missed opportunity. And so he said he felt like it was a stewardship question of my gifts, but also how we are shaping the women in this area and being a good steward of their gifts. And so that was pretty cool, just that he would have that heart for women's gifts in the church and that he would be such an advocate for me. But that is how I ended up taking the teaching pastor position. And the other thing about it that is so great and why I'm really thankful that God had me marry Ike, a man who would push me to do something like that, is that I love preaching. I love preaching to our church more than I could go speak to like an arena of people. But the anonymity of that versus speaking to our people who I know their stories and we are shepherding them and discipling them, I just love it more than I ever could have dreamed. And so it was really sweet that it was my husband that led me to take that step and then to experience the joy that I never knew I would have in it. So that's the story.
Oh my gosh, I love that story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I think that just so many of the things you said will resonate with our listeners. And I truly love the fact that your husband pushed you towards this calling or this position, however you want to look at it. I really appreciate that. I'd love to dive into your book. So I want to talk about your book, Nice. And in the book, you start off by saying, God did not call you to be nice. And I'd love for you to talk about why this is true.
Yeah. Well, can I back up a little bit and share just where the book came from?
Please do.
Okay. I think that's really helpful. So my first book came out a couple years ago called Free of Me. And in the first chapter of that book, I think it's the first chapter, I had this little paragraph where I was looking back on my childhood and reflecting on how I was this really nice Christian girl. And in hindsight, I can see that at the time, if you'd asked me, why are you such a nice Christian girl? Like, why are you such a high achiever? Why are you such a rule follower? Why are you such a good kid? I would have said because of my faith, because I'm a Christian. But in hindsight, what I could see is that my motives were more complicated than that I was also a really nice Christian girl because it was personally rewarding for me. It earned me a lot of approval, especially from adults and authority figures in my life. And I was the kind of kid that really craved that. I loved approval. And so it was personally beneficial to me also to be a really nice Christian girl. And so I could look back and see how my motives were layered at the time. And so I wrote that just in like a little paragraph or two. It wasn't a big part of the book at all. And I hadn't planned to write on it anymore. But after that book came out, I kept thinking about that section. And I felt haunted by it, honestly, because I realized that it was not a tendency that I had left behind me in childhood, but that it had followed me into adulthood and that it had also followed me into ministry. And the point where this became really evident to me was a number of years ago. I felt like God was pressing me to write a blog post on a controversial topic. It was related to race. And the topic that I wanted to write on, like what I wanted to say, I knew it was biblical. I knew it was close to the heart of God. There was nothing about it that felt unnecessarily controversial. but we live in such a polarized moment that I knew there would probably be people who didn't like it, didn't want me to talk about that. They wanted me to stay in kind of a particular box. And so before I hit publish on it, I really agonized over it and thought, how are people going to respond? Or am I going to lose readers? Are people going to be upset with me? Are they going to tell me I'm distracting from the gospel? All this. And then I thought, gosh, you know what? I am hesitating to be obedient. I'm hesitating to teach the word of God because I'm so enslaved to this nice girl image. And that nice girl image, and this is the ugly truth that if we're going to talk about women in leadership, we have to be honest about, is that there is a nice Christian girl image that if you are in ministry will be very profitable for you. And I use that word intentionally because it will make you money. It will actually make you money. Like if you only talk about certain things, people will like you. And so if you stray outside of that, people will not like you and they'll be very upset about you. And so, I realized that I was still serving this and that it had continued to benefit me to serve it. And I had to make a choice between continuing to serve that nice girl image or to serve God. And so that was a really defining moment for me of which was it going to be. And the more I dug into it, the more I could see how this is a constant choice that is before believers. And we see this all throughout the Old Testament with prophets where they have to make the choice between being liked or being, the prophets of God. So that's the seed of it all. And that is, God never called us to be nice is a very striking statement. A lot of people ask me about it, but it's true. I mean, it's not that being nice is bad or wrong. I'm not out to villainize it, but the word is not in the Bible and it's not a fruit of the Spirit. And there's a reason for that because we're called to higher and better things.
I can relate to so much of what you just shared and just that idea of, being nervous before hitting publish on the blog post or even now podcasting. It's like, I know there's times that we bring up topics that are potentially going to lose listeners or, give us the 1-star review instead of 5 stars or whatever. And it's so true that but it's not what God has called us to do, is just to please everybody. So you mentioned that niceness is not a fruit of the Spirit, but kindness is. So can you tell us what you think is the difference between niceness and kindness?
Yeah. So this idea, this way of distinguishing it is not original to me. There is an author, I believe his name is Barry Corey. I'm not flipping it because he's got 2 first names. I think it's Barry Corey.
Okay.
Is love kindness. Just look up love kindness.
Okay.
And he wrote about this really brilliantly. He said to imagine niceness as having soft edges and a squishy core. And then he said to contrast that with harshness, which has hard edges and a firm core. And he said kindness is kind of a combination of the two, where you have the soft edges of niceness. You have love and you have patience and you have gentleness, but it has a firm core. It has fortitude. It has a spine. It doesn't, collapse in on itself as soon as it experiences any pushback. Now, practically, how I think you can discern this in yourself is how you respond when your niceness or kindness is not reciprocated. How do you respond? Because niceness, it seems to be about the other person, but it's really about you. It's about trying to ensure a certain type of response. Like you don't want conflict, you don't want pushback, and so you're just nice. So you put niceness out into the world and you expect niceness to come back. When niceness doesn't come back, niceness flips into bitterness and entitlement.
Mm.
And it's the, how could they treat me that, I was so nice to them. How could that waiter have been so rude? How could that neighbor have said that to me? And, you hold on to it and you seethe, for hours and hours, and you go home and you tell your husband about it. That is what niceness is, like classic niceness. But kindness is fundamentally, because it's a fruit of the Spirit, it's fundamentally oriented towards God, love of God, and love of others. And so kindness is not about eliciting a particular response. It's simply about being faithful and loving people. And so it perseveres regardless of how it is treated, instead of flipping into bitterness and entitlement. And I will say that has been very convicting to me personally. Just again and again, when I realized that. So that's been helpful to me personally.
I love that you talk about how niceness is really self-serving, because we as a culture really put that on as like a badge of honor. And it's so true when I heard you say that it flips into bitterness and harshness, how quickly we see that, especially in the social media world. But when someone doesn't feel like someone is being nice or whatnot, it automatically turns nasty.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
And so I love the contrast between nice and kind.
Mm-hmm.
I would love for you to talk about why you think niceness is a problem and why it's so important that the church uproot this.
Mm-hmm.
Why it's a problem within the church.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot of reasons. And one reason that this is, I don't know when this particular podcast is going to air, but we are recording this less than a week before Christmas.
Yes. Thank you.
So I know. I'm not panicking at all. And
yeah, me either.
Says the church planter. Yeah. So one metaphor that I use in the book that is really timely for this time of year is I tell this story about a number of years ago when we bought a Christmas tree. So we are real Christmas tree people. We don't do fake Christmas trees. We do real Christmas trees. But we had been told that there was this big box store that had discount trees, that you could get a big tree for like $25. So we thought, that is our kind of deal. So we went and we realized when we got there that it was, you get what you paid for. And so we found a tree that we thought was going to work. It had some holes in it. It had some brown spots. It was, not the best looking tree, but I thought I can work with this. I can just cover it up. Like it'll be fine. So we take this tree home, and that's exactly what I did. It was kind of a Charlie Brown Christmas tree, sort of a miracle. And so it looked really, really beautiful. But about a week after we bought it, I noticed that the tree was not taking in any water. And, especially when you first get those trees, it just guzzles water because it's been so dry. And I thought, this is not a good sign. Like I don't know a lot about plants. I don't know a lot about trees, but this is not good. And so it stopped taking in water. And then the branches got really dry. The needles got really prickly to the point where, I'm not kidding you, our kids would start crying because they accidentally like bumped into our tree. So it was bad. It was very dry, and the green started to fade and was starting to yellow and brown. And so all this was pointing to, that this is not going well. But then there was one morning where I walked into our living room, and the benefit of having a real tree is the smell. Like it smells so good.
Mm.
And so I walk in expecting this, crisp evergreen smell. And instead, I smelled what I assume is mildew. And our tree was starting to rot. And so that was when I realized that our tree, it wasn't just a bad tree, it was a dead tree. We had a dead tree. And it was too late at that point to buy a new tree. And so we just kind of kept it up and then almost never turned on the lights because I was afraid it would just go up in flames. This is like Clark Griswold, Christmas Vacation. But every time I walked past that tree, I saw it in kind of a new way that I'd never thought about our trees before. But when you get a live tree, when you get a real tree, and you bring it into your home and you dress it up, it looks gorgeous, but you don't really think about the fact that because this tree has been cut off from its root system, it is actually a dead tree. Like it is an actively dying tree. And this felt like such a metaphor for faith, how we will hang these spiritual ornaments on our branches. We will be nice people. We'll be nice Christians. We will, treat people well, and we will, be really involved at church and like do all these good things. And it looks so good, but it covers up the fact that underneath we are uprooted and very, very often withering. And this is the trap of niceness, is that we are so good at putting on that mask. Like, especially those of us who are raised in the church, is we know how to be a good looking Christian. We know we're very good at looking good. And because of that, we can hide for a really long time the true state of our souls. It's really easy to not be honest about it. And I think the most deceptive thing about this, really, and this is the thing I find myself addressing all the time in our church, is that we deceive others with our appearance, but we also deceive ourselves. And we think this is what it means to be a Christian. We think this is what it means to be free. And there are so many people in the church who are not actually free, because they've settled for this appearance of Christianity instead of the real thing. And it really, I feel this urgency for it, because Jesus came and died for us to be entirely free, not just like half free, not just kind of toe in the water free. And we won't get there until we finally take off the mask and come into the light and be really honest about the true state of our souls.
I love how you just shared that analogy of the tree, and you talk about that in the book quite a bit. And you talk about how one of the fruits of niceness is corruption, and that niceness can blind us to the truth of what's going on. And you just mentioned that idea that it can blind us both from other people, but also from seeing the truth in ourselves. So you also bring up the need for discernment. And you mentioned the quote that I love is, discernment is not something we are born with. It is something we acquire. So can you share why you believe it's so important for us to develop this discernment, and maybe some ways that we can do that as leaders?
Yeah. So that chapter, it was a little bit different than the others, because I was looking at how we, in general, I was looking at how we sort of use niceness to distract, what's really going on underneath ourselves, and then like the bad fruit that it produces. But with that chapter on corruption, I was looking also at the ways that we will settle for the appearance of niceness in other people, and how that allows their corruption to flourish unchecked. And I think we're seeing the fruit of this everywhere right now. I think that's kind of what the whole Me Too movement is. But the example that I give in the book is of the USA gymnastics abuse scandal with Rachel Denhollander and Dr. Larry Nassar. And for those listeners who aren't familiar with this story, there was a doctor who saw, I believe it was hundreds of gymnasts, and these are like Olympic level gymnasts. And it turned out he had this history of abusing like over 100 of these girls. And the thing that is especially devastating about it is that some of these girls sought help. They actually went to their parents, or they went to their coaches, or they went to officials and said, this is happening. But because he had such a reputation as being this internationally renowned doctor, and he was friends with some of these adults as well, is they didn't believe them. And it's just tragic. And I talk about this in the book, just the ways that has affected some of these girls' relationships with their parents because of that. And, because the parents understand now that was the wrong choice. But I think that story is helpful for a number of reasons. One, it exposes how willingly we will believe the nice appearance, even if there are signs that there is a problem. It is very beneficial to us to accept when someone is nice to us. It's kind of easy to say, well, that's not really my problem. Like, they're nice to me, and not pay attention to other red flags that I would say that scripture actually tells us to look for. And you see this all the time. Like, another example I give is a lot of these Dateline stories where women will marry these guys and then they'll say, he was my Prince Charming, and then we got married and he completely changed. But then when you go back and kind of look at the tapes, you're like, well, actually there was this sign and there was this sign and there was this sign, but it served you to only pay attention to this one image that he wanted you to see. So there's that, is just to name this temptation in all of us, that when it serves us, when it is your pastor who baptized your kids or who led you to Christ or who has meant a lot to you and has been so nice to your family, it serves you to believe that one particular image instead of, anything else that you might learn about them. When it is your, political party's leader, like whatever it is, we are very tempted to settle for the nice image because it's self-serving. So that's the first reason that USA Gymnastics story is really important. The second is this story reminds us why discernment matters. That this is not simply about the purity of the faith. This is not simply about us not being duped by people, but this is also about us protecting the least of these and about being the people of God who represent the character of God and God's care for the vulnerable. And that we will fail to do that if we settle for just this facade of niceness. And so at the intersection of this question is our witness as the people of God and how we care for people in this world as well. So it's a huge issue. It's very important.
I would love for you to tell us how you think being involved in a Christian community can help us develop and practice discernment, because I think it's something we all know that we need, especially as leaders, but I don't know if we know how to practice it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing that has become really important to me personally is integrity, just believing in the power of our ideals. I think that's actually a quote that John McCain said that I thought was really beautiful before he died. Just the power of our ideals, that when Jesus calls us to be holy, that isn't just a neutral posture, but that actually accomplishes something in the world. And so we don't have to lower ourselves and choose the lesser of two evils. We don't have to lower ourselves and just be pragmatic. We don't have to lower ourselves because we're just being realistic. This is the real world. No, like, we are called to be holy and we are called to be set apart. And so that means having integrity in big things and small. And I think that we can look both inside and outside the church and see that we're in this crisis of integrity in our leaders. And that is something that we can be developing now, thinking about leadership on this podcast, is that your integrity is not just about when you are faced with a really difficult, big decision, what are you going to do? But what are the small decisions you are making now? And if you're compromising now on little things because you're saying this is a little thing, you will compromise on the big things. And so just to say over and over and over and over again, I can't say it enough, that integrity matters, character matters, holiness matters, being above reproach, it matters. And it matters in the small things and it matters in the big things. And so that's the first. And then the second is to say, there are times when we are honest to goodness deceived by people. And there's nothing that we could have done differently. But very often, I think that we are unintentionally or intentionally complicit in corruption that happens in our world and in the church. And so what I want to say too is to remember that Jesus doesn't need our protection. I think we believe that I have to protect, when something comes out about a leader that you admire, it's like I have to protect our church, or I have to protect the gospel, that if this comes out, people will not want to know Jesus. This will stand in the way of people coming to Jesus. But I think what we're seeing over and over again is no, that is actually a lie. What stands in the way of people coming to the church, what stands in the way of people coming to Jesus is if we are more concerned with the church's reputation than with people's freedom and safety. That will stand in the way. And so we're not in this for our reputations anyway. Like our churches will pass away. Like you and I, we will pass away. Our reputations don't mean anything. We don't need to protect ourselves or our churches or our church leaders. Like we have the freedom of saying, yes, like we fail. We are sinners. We make mistakes. But do you know who doesn't? Jesus. And so that is a practice that it's incredibly difficult when it's your church, and it's incredibly difficult when it's your leader or your pastor. And I totally have so much compassion when you are in that situation. But to know that keeping things in the dark, that hiding things for the sake of a church's reputation or a short-term stopgap of some sort, that it is always the wrong decision, that we just need to just fall on our sword, just admit our human frailty, and then point people to the one who never fails.
Mm. So appreciative of all of that. And I think that we are completely on board with what you shared. In fact, we did an episode a few weeks ago about what to do when you have messed up as a leader. And Holly shared some really great tips on to be open and honest about it as leaders, instead of trying to sweep stuff under the rug, or like you said, protect our reputation or protect our church's reputation. That doesn't, in the long run, in the short term, it might cover us up for a little bit, but in the long run, it doesn't help anyone. And it certainly doesn't benefit the faith. So I think that's so important. So you also talk about this whole idea of, niceness appeals to our desire to have influence and to have people like us and follow us. We kind of started off our conversation around that idea. And I think for our podcast listeners, especially those in leadership, that rings true. Like we all want to have people following us in some capacity, even if we say, oh, no, it's all about God. Like there's still a level of, like you said, when you go to hit publish or when you get up on stage, you want people to like what you say. But you also talk about the need to actually be willing to grow less and to prune and be willing to lose people. So why do you think that it's important for us to be willing to lose people as leaders?
Yeah, so this was a principle that I discovered in nature, and that's what kind of the second half of the book is looking at. The first half looks at what are the bad fruits of niceness, and then the second half is looking at how do we cultivate something better. And so I looked at different farming practices because God put these principles into creation to teach us about himself. And so I one of the things I learned is that there's this type of pruning, like I'd heard of pruning before, but there's this type of pruning called thinning, where you have, say, a peach tree and the peach farmer will thin the branches, like he'll cut off some of the branches because every peach tree has a limited reserve of nutrients. And so if the tree just grows as much fruit as possible, it spreads those nutrients really, really thin. And as a result, the peaches are smaller and they are less flavorful and they're a lower quality fruit. And so this thinning, it allows more nutrients to go. So it's less fruit, but it's better fruit. And this is I probably could have written a whole book just on that one metaphor.
Yeah.
That is it's so powerful. It's so powerful. I mean, I didn't even talk about this in the book, but I think it applies to our need to say no a lot more, because niceness doesn't like to say no. You like to say yes to everything. And as a result, you just get spread really thin and you're not really doing anything well. And so just the goodness of saying no so that you're bearing less but better fruit. But I think too, we as in ministry, it's tempting to measure your ministry success by the numbers. And this is something that I feel very acutely as a church planter, because in your first year of the church, the name of the game is survival. You are trying to survive that first year. And so it's tempting. It really is tempting to think through in your sermons what will be most broadly appealing to everybody, and to avoid topics that are difficult, that people might not like, and they might leave the church because of that. And there was a period of time in our first year where I felt like we were leaning a little bit too far in that direction. And I think that another way of describing broadly appealing is just to call it bland. And there's a market for bland. Like people like bland, especially if it's, sugary in a way. But how we are not called to that. We see this in the Old Testament, we see this in the New Testament, that we are called sometimes to actually lose people. And we see this with the life of Jesus, where people rejected him, but we see it in this crazy story in Ezekiel when God sends him to a people and he says, they will not listen to you, but go anyway and say what I am telling you to say. Like, he doesn't alter his message to make it more appealing in some way. And that is why that message has endured, is because he didn't water it down. He didn't disobey. He didn't, trade it in for something less powerful. And so we reached a point as a church where we turned away from that and went back to preaching a bolder, more truthful message. But I think that again, that pragmatism of thinking what is going to gain the most number of people is a really tricky question, and it makes a really poor compass. And the thing that I always think about with our church is that, people love candy. Like, I love candy. I love chocolate. If you are giving out candy, people will eat it. But what people are craving is a meal. What they really want is a filling meal. And when they encounter that, they will come back. They will, very often. And if they don't, they weren't going to stay. They were waiting for the reason to leave, and nothing you would have said would have kept them. So yeah, grow less.
I love that, because I think it ties in so well with the series that we've been doing on communication. And I think one of the things that we're really passionate about is the need for leaders to be willing to say really hard things and have hard conversations and deal with conflict. And I think that goes right along with what you're saying, because if it doesn't tickle the ear, people probably aren't going to stay. So I'm wondering how you think niceness keeps us from having these conversations and dealing with this conflict, and what do we need to do differently?
Yeah, this happens up until now. I've been talking a lot about leading a church, leading in ministry. And so for people that's not where you're leading, this plays out in a lot of different ways, but it especially plays out relationally, where you don't want to have that hard conversation with somebody because it's hard. You don't like conflict. You don't want to potentially alienate them or break the friendship, or especially if they're a family member. But where the rubber really meets the road is when we're talking about something like, I have a ton of family members that have been alcoholics, and a lot of them have died because of that. And so you're faced in situations like that with, I see this family member who is developing this really concerning addiction. And I could choose to be nice and to not say anything about it and to continue to have, an easy relationship with them. Or I could be honest and truthful with them, which is the loving and truly kind thing to do. Same with if you have a friend, or maybe this is a coworker who is starting to become flirtatious with another married coworker or something like that. You can be nice, you can maintain the status quo by just not saying anything, just smiling, just laughing it off, rolling your eyes, whatever. Or you can do the loving thing and actually speaking up. And that is, I think, the central question there is, what is loving? What is loving to them? And it really is hard, and it forces you to die to self, because niceness will never ask you to die to yourself. Niceness will keep yourself intact forever. But being loving means you can say something out of just the purest desire for them to flourish as a person, and they will probably accuse you of like the most horrible things. Like in best case scenario, they don't. In best case scenario, they receive what you have to say. But I've been in that position of saying a hard thing and then being accused of being judgmental. Like, people know exactly what to say to make you feel like garbage and to make you feel like, and to make you question your own motives, where you're thinking, well, maybe I wasn't, maybe I am being judgmental. And it's so, goodness gracious, it is so hard. But at the end of the day, just asking, what is gentle, what is loving, like what is kind, what does actual love for this person look like? And knowing full well that you're going to have to die to yourself in the process, but that means that you've chosen the narrow path instead of the wide one.
Mm. Yeah, you mentioned this idea of flourishing, and that's kind of how you end the book. Near the end of the book, you talk about flourishing in the wilderness and the need for us to be able to be courageous in our conversations with people, in our leadership. And I love how you kind of talk about some different disciplines that we need to cultivate in order to develop this ability to be courageous, because I think, like you said, we don't, when we do step up and we are bold and courageous, sometimes it hurts. Like sometimes we do not get any kind of positive feedback from people. So what are some of these disciplines that we need to develop in order to become courageous in our words, in our life, in our leadership?
Yeah, I list a lot, and so it's hard to even pick one, but I think I've touched on a lot of them. Just it really comes down to the small daily acts of faithfulness. The small daily acts of being honest instead of being deceptive, or just simply being nice or being inauthentic. Those small daily acts of having integrity instead of, choosing self-preservation. The small daily acts of exercising courage. Even those small acts, I think of courage a lot like a muscle that has to be strengthened. And I think we always think that, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but that when I'm in that moment to make the big decision where I'm gonna, if I ever have to be faced with this huge moral dilemma where I have to be a courageous person, I want to be that person. But if you're not practicing courage now, you won't do it. You probably won't. And so just practicing those things now, but most importantly of all, just being in the Word of God daily, praying daily, that these are all forming us into a very particular person that bears the fruit of the Spirit. And that's really one of the things I try to get down to here is, we look at the world and we see a lot of anger, and we see a lot of division, and we see, people being ugly on social media. And it's easy to look at that and think, well, what's so wrong with being nice? But what we are doing with niceness is, like I said earlier, just kind of hanging ornaments on a tree. It's just a mask. It's just a very superficial veneer that we're putting on, but the tree itself is still sick. And so looking at what are the ways, what are the practices that God has given us to nurture and cultivate a healthier tree. And of course, that starts with just time with Him.
So good. I just want to be like, amen, hallelujah, the whole time you're talking. if I just need like a big highlighter over everything
Yes.
you're saying.
Well, this is, you guys can't see it, but my book, see how many sticky notes I have in there?
Yes, it's so great. Oh my gosh. Okay. So one of the things that I think ties in really well with what you're saying is that you talk about ways to cultivate a better tree is to embrace your design, the way that God created you, rather than trying to gain acceptance by being nice. And that is so one of the things that we really talk about here on the podcast is how God's wired you and the gifts that He's given you. And so I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that you've personally embraced your design?
That is a great question. You're the first person to ask me that. Like everyone
I
asked
can't
me.
take credit for that. Esther wrote that question. So
Oh, really?
that's all Esther.
Yeah. Well, everyone kind of asks me big picture, like how to do it, but no one has asked me how, specifically I have done that. That's a really great question. Yeah, I think so to give people like a little bit of context too, another farming lesson that I learned was about tomatoes and how, heirloom tomatoes are really good, but then you get those nasty, pale, watery ones on your burger at Wendy's. And it's kind of like, how are these related? Like, why are they so different? And the reason is that heirloom tomatoes haven't been genetically modified. But the perfectly red round ones, they were genetically modified to make them more attractive. They're kind of more appealing to the eye, whereas heirlooms are, they're kind of funky looking. And so they are more appealing to the eye. They look perfect. But the gene that makes them look perfect, it also turns off the flavor gene. And that when I read that, I thought, man, if that is not a metaphor for life, that if you make yourself look like everybody else, in order to be accepted, how you're turning off the thing that kind of makes you flavorful. And so I think for me, I have learned in a lot of ways how to. So I'm sure this is very clear. I'm pretty loud. I'm only
You're in good company.
Yeah, I'm only 5'2", and so I make up for it with volume. And whenever I get off the stage, regularly people think, "Oh, I thought you were taller." So yeah, I have a very strong personality, a very big personality, and I have not personally wrestled with feeling like I'm too much for people. I know some people with big personalities do wrestle with that. I'm not. I'm very much if I'm too much for you, then you're a weak person. But some of that, honestly, that comes from my dad and my husband because they've never made me feel like I was too much. And so I'm around men who their strength does not require my weakness. And so I'm just really thankful for that. But there are other ways where I still, because I'm a verbal processor, I'm very good with my words, but I can also sin with my words really easily. And so I stick my foot in my mouth a lot. I am very opinionated. And so that has like one thing I'm really learning, I'm having to literally study is empathy and learning how to put myself in another person's shoes. And so I am not trying to do away with some essential part of what God gave me because there are people that don't like my personality. There have been men who I think were intimidated or said things that made it feel like they didn't like that part of my personality. And instead of just making myself quieter, shutting myself up, making myself smaller, adjusting myself to just fit what I think they wanted, I instead just looked at, okay, some of this is how God made me. What, if any part of this, am I sinning? Like, what, if any part of this, do I need to refine? What, if any part of this needs to be sanctified to look more like Jesus, because I can be loud, I can have a big personality, but if I'm using that to hurt people, that's not okay. If I'm using my words to cut people down, if I'm using my words because I'm quicker with my words than my husband, if I'm using my words to win arguments with him just because I can, that's not Christ-like. And so figuring out based on who God made me, how do I look more like Jesus? But Jesus was feisty. I mean, holy moly, he was not a wallflower. And so, anytime we are making ourselves, quieter or smaller just because we want to be accepted, is to remember that Jesus was feisty, and God called some really, feisty people. And so that doesn't mean we can sin in our feistiness, but to refine it into the likeness of Christ is what we're called to.
Mm. Yeah. I love that. And we talk a lot on the podcast about this idea of how God has wired us all differently. And that's a good thing, but not to use our personality, like I think you talk about in the book, personality assessments and things like this can be helpful, but not to use those as an excuse to keep sinning or to keep just doing what we feel like doing instead of actually becoming more like Jesus. So I love that you summed that up so nicely. So we have just a couple more questions for you. And I want to just thank you so much for sharing all of what you've shared so far about this issue of niceness and how we really should not be striving for niceness, but really going deeper in our faith and leadership. So I'd love for you to share, if you would like, just a few habits and routines that help you to be an effective leader, because you have so many different things going on. I'm curious how you sort of, I'm not going to say balance, but manage all the different responsibilities.
Yeah. So Sabbath is huge for us. We have to have it. And so Saturday is Sabbath for us. And that is a time, because our kids are so little, we're not just laying around watching Netflix, which sounds really nice, but it's a time to not work. Like, we are not we're not responding to emails. We're not working on church stuff. We actually don't talk about the church. We want to have just that mental rest as well, that emotional margin. And we intentionally take that time just to enjoy our kids. So that's what Sabbath looks like. This is adjacent to Sabbath, but I have a lot of boundaries, and I do have to say no a lot. And so I say no to a lot of speaking engagements. We've decided for now, while the kids are little, and with the church being brand new, that being away once a month is about all that we can handle. It's a lot when I'm gone, and especially because usually I'm gone on weekends, and which is a terrible time for me to be gone. And so it just requires a ton of planning on this end of who's going to take the kids, because my husband is preaching. And so it's saying no to a lot and just being okay with that. And there are times when I get on Instagram and I see, my friends who are traveling more and are doing more. And I think, I wish I could look that important, to be traveling all that. But I would much rather not be stressed out all the time. That's a big one.
Yeah.
I love not being stressed. And so I set boundaries so that I don't turn into like an anxious person all the time. I really prize, not being stressed all the time. And so that's big for me too, is just boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm so interested to hear what you have to say to the answer to this question. But if you could share advice with a younger leader who's just starting out in ministry or in their career, what would you tell her?
So this is a big heartbeat of mine right now. I feel like I'm talking about it a lot, but I would say don't quit. I would say keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going. That resilience, that perseverance is the thing that distinguishes between those who, achieve something eternal and worthwhile versus those that just get taken out along the way. And it's so, whatever you feel like God is calling you to trust that enough to keep going when you fail, when it doesn't happen right away. And that was a hard lesson for me, even when I was 22 and just working as an intern. I thought, I was greater than that. I was greater than making copies and getting coffee and stuff like that. And I had to die to myself during that. But just to know that most of the leaders that you see are there because they persevered when no one was paying attention to them. And we all think we're special and that I'll be the one that rises to the top. But part of the reason that people get to the position where they're at is because of who God formed them to be in those shepherd years of obscurity. And so to not despise those shepherd years, but to really receive them as a gift, that this is a season when God is creating you to be the leader that He wants you to be. And that if you skip over that part, you will fail, but you will fail much more publicly and catastrophically. Mm-hmm. And so to just receive the grace of the slow climb is what I would say.
Mm-hmm. So good.
Ooh, chills. Somebody needs to hear that, and it might have been me. So
it was definitely me too. So
thank you, Sharon. So we believe that leaders are learners, and we always love to wrap up our interview with finding out something that you are learning. It could be something God is teaching you from His Word, or maybe a book or a podcast you've listened to lately that you think would benefit our audience.
So the podcast that has just set my imagination on fire this year, I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called This Cultural Moment. Have you heard of it?
I have heard of it. Yes, I have.
I need to re-listen to it. It has it's connected dots. It has helped me to understand ministry in my context in a way that nothing else has. And it's these two pastors, one in Portland named John Mark Comer, and then one in Melbourne, Australia named Mark Sayers. And they are both doing ministry in post-Christian contexts. So they're in very secular, liberal cities. And Mark in particular, he is just brilliant. I mean, crazy well-read. John Mark is basically on there to just interpret him, when he kind of starts to like spiral off. He's like, wait, hold on. He's like, so what are you saying? Which is very helpful. Yeah. But he has this read on what is happening in our culture that to me, it was like hearing for the first time something that made sense. And so it's so smart. It's so interesting. So I would highly recommend that.
I love that. I have not heard of that podcast, but it sounds super duper interesting. And so I'm definitely going to check that out.
Yeah, check it out. Let me know what you guys think.
We love podcasts around here.
We do. We'll put the link in the show notes too for people.
Okay. Sounds great.
So Sharon, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We have really enjoyed this conversation, and we're going to get out our highlighter and highlight all of the things that you said. I'm wondering if you can tell our listeners where they can connect with you and learn more about all the things that you are doing.
So my website is sheworships.com, but blogging has been one of those things I've had to say no to in this season because I just cannot do it. And so it's my poor little neglected blog is on there, but I'm more active on Instagram, which is just Sharon H. Miller.
Awesome. We will put the links. We have the links to all your social and your website to go check out there. So again, we want to thank you for being on with us today, Sharon, and we appreciate your time.
Oh, it was great. I had so much fun.
Thanks for joining us on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider leaving us a rating and review in your podcast app? This helps more women just like you find the podcast, and it also helps them to know whether the podcast would be a good fit for them. Just go to the show in your podcast app, then scroll down until you see the option for ratings and reviews. From there, you can tap to rate and write a review. It means the world to us when you take a couple minutes to do this, and thank you so much to everyone who has left a review. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.